Welcome to the 18th century from 1700 to 1790 in chapter 10 of your textbook. In this chapter, we enter obviously into the 18th century. Previously, we had Louis XIV. Now we have his great grandson who's supposed to be ruling France, but he's too young. So until he comes of age, there's a regent who's taking care of ruling the country, and so they call this the Regency period. So here's a picture of them all grown up. Madame Pompadour is influential on fashion during this period. She was born in 1721 to a wealthy family, and she was considered at the time to have had a refined education. She was married at 20, and then 4 years later, she was introduced to the King of France at a masquerade ball. Shortly thereafter, she left her husband and moved into Versailles to be the king's mistress, and he built a separate apartment especially for her with a secret staircase to his quarters. So the palace was completed in 1700, and the palace wasn't only the residence of the king, but it was the home of thousands of other people. So when you were at the palace, you were being seen. When she arrived, well, when they both arrived, the palace was ruled by a very strict code, and the King of France was bored and he felt oppressed. And Madame Pompadour was an independent woman who enjoyed the arts and politics. And so it was already, how shall we say, inappropriate, yes, unconventional, sort of a slap in the face to all these rules to have the mistress living there. And then she was given some autonomy and some authority. And so she exerted her opinions and her aesthetic on the palace. She was only his mistress for 5 years, but they were friends for longer, and she was his confidant, and he would tell her things and she would advise him. And she was blamed for a lot of the things that went wrong. She stimulated his interest in architecture and arts, and she was able to spend a lot of money on the arts, and she encouraged the decorative arts, including promoting the porcelain factory at Sèvres, which then produced the finest china. She became the style maker of the day, and her apartment reflected her preferences. She liked rose and green and small-scale furniture. She developed a simpler, more feminine style than her predecessor, decorating in floral Rococo manner, which was often called Pompadour style. It's similar to the Queen Anne style of England, but with more comfort and sophistication. All of her stuff was sold off to English and Russian noblemen after Versailles was stormed in 1789. So here's some pictures of her in all of her splendor. So here's the next king of France. And here is Marie Antoinette. She was the Queen of France, and here she is with her children. These were some propaganda pictures because she wasn't very popular. She was young and impetuous, and she wasn't seen as being very queenly or very motherly. So they commissioned some portraits to try and improve her reputation. So here she is, the lovely Marie Antoinette. Very fashionable. This is the Petit Trianon it's on the property of Versailles, and it was like Marie Antoinette's little playground. It was supposed to be like a village in the Swiss Alps or something, and she would prance around here with her friends and pretend she was, I don't know, a farmer or something. And it's rumored that she would dye the sheep to match whatever dress she was wearing that day. So I just picture her prancing around the pond here in a pink dress with a bunch of little, like a little flock of pink sheep chasing her around. So your book talks about enlightenment and how it changed the rules of Western society, um, and it was supposed to be um, rather than like fighting and brute force, it was supposed to be more about like wits and intelligence. And women did well in this with this set of rules, so their position was advanced a bit during this period. Arts and philosophy of the time glorified women, and the style most associated with the 18th century, the Rococo style, is full of what psychologists call feminine forms. So, some things that were going on with respect to fashion is that there were lots of apprenticeships and lots of differentiation and specialization. So, there were people who made collars and people who made shoes and gloves and lace, and people who made certain kinds of dresses and wigs. And there were just all kinds of jobs for people in the fashion industry. And the way you would get a job in the fashion industry is instead of going to school, you would get an apprenticeship and you would work under someone who was an expert pretty much for free. There was no standard, so you could get like a really good apprenticeship where you were well taken care of and maybe they gave you a place to stay and they fed you and they treated you with respect, or you could end up somewhere where you were just a slave basically. But at the end of it, you were supposed to be qualified to run your own business or to be gainfully employed either by the person who gave you the apprenticeship or some other specialist. Clothing was divided into categories according to the time of day or the occasion for which it was appropriate. So there was the kind of thing you wear at home when no one was around, and they called that undress or nightgown. And then dress is what you would wear when you went out in public. And full dress was your most formal evening wear. And then you can see the image here. The fashion was to wear a wig and then to have it powdered so that it was white. So that was kind of a messy affair. So there was a powdering jacket. So it was something you would wear while your jacket was being powdered so that you weren't covered in powder, and then you would go and get dressed the rest of the way. And then there was a frock coat, which was a man's coat. So this is a men's nightgown. This is the informal kind of thing that you would wear at home when no one was around. So same is true for women, that just a couple of different things. So here, let's go here. So undress or half dress or morning dress is what you wear before anybody's around. There was something called a false rump, which is what was used to give some back fullness to the popular silhouette at the time. A habit was a custom suit or a horseback riding suit. Um, there was a coat or a petticoat, which were skirts that were worn underneath a dress to give the dress some fullness or the skirt some fullness. There were men who paid a lot of attention to their appearance during this time period, and they were referred to as macaronis. Um, and that was after a Italian phrase. They were also called bows or coxcombs or fops. And the macaroni term is referred to in that song, Yankee Doodle stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni. It means he stuck a feather in his hat, um, to be fancy and called himself macaroni. He was trying to be fashionable. So we're still using the fashion dolls or the fashion babies to disseminate information about what's being worn by the most fashionable people. This is an image of a short gown, which is a hip-length garment like a jacket or an overblouse. It was, for casual, for working. Hydraulics were the latest innovation in production. So water was being used to make machinery go faster. Less affluent, meaning people with less money, produce their own cloth still. It was still called homespun. And weavers would travel to households to weave textiles. Some weavers had their own shops. Clothes were mostly custom made by tailors or by women of the household. There was some ready made clothes available in stores, but it was pretty limited. And clothes were pretty expensive. And believe it or not, theft of clothing was pretty common. Fashionable men would sometimes stuff their calves to give them the desired shape. I have some images here of an outfit that George Washington wore on the day of his inauguration. It's not what he wore to the ceremony, but it's a good example of what someone would be wearing at that time. So here's the vest that he would wear underneath the overcoat. And here's the breeches that he would wear. Some French had an obsession with all things English. That was called Anglomania. Reading totes was their name for the riding habits, which is the outfit that a woman would wear when she was horseback riding. Men's drawers were worn next to the skin beneath the breeches, so like underwear. There was, lots of different fashions. And one little fashion that your book mentions is the Steinkirk. It's where you take the cravat, which is the white linen or lace piece of fabric that's tied around the neck. It's the predecessor to the modern men's tie. Well, they would lace it around and twist it loosely and then put the end through a buttonhole. Boot cuffs were these big, exaggerated cuffs that went from the wrist all the way up to the elbow. Spatterdashers, spats, or gaiters were a protective covering that extended from the knee over the ankle to cover the top of the shoe to protect against mud. And then another new a new item was the fall, which is a square central flap that buttoned to the waistline as part of the closure on the fronts of breeches. So you can see that over here. A frock coat in the early 1700s. It's a men's coat. It was cut shorter and looser than dress coats, and they had flat turned down collars that were usually held in place with buttons. By 1730, frock coats were considered suitable for country wear. After 1770, frock coats were accepted for more formal wear as well. So it was kind of like casual Fridays happening. Frock coats could be made from serge, which is a twill weave fabric with a characteristic diagonal wail. Worsted is a fine, smooth yarn spun from combed, long staple fibers with no nap, meaning it's not fuzzy. And staple fibers, worsted, it usually means wool. Usually we say worsted wool. Wail is one of the parallel ribs or ridges in the surface of a fabric such as corduroy, denim, or twill. It makes a sound when you drag your fingernails across it. If you reach down and kind of scratch your thigh, if you're wearing jeans, it'll make kind of a zipping noise. That's your nails running across the wails in the fabric. And then a twill weave, we talked about this before too. It's a basic structure where the filling yarns, which are the weft yarns, are woven over and under two or more warp yarns, producing these diagonal patterns that you can see below. So frock coats could be made from plush fabric, which is a fabric with a long, even pile. It's a little less dense than velvet. And then we've talked about pile before too. In textiles, pile is a raised surface or nap of a fabric, which it's made from, here I have an image here. It's made from, the loops are cut. So I have images, more modern images of the loops. And then they cut the loops and that creates that fuzzy surface. A frock, later called a smock, was a washable linen outer garment worn by agricultural workers. But smocking is an embroidery technique used to gather fabric so that it can stretch. Before elastic, smocking was commonly used in cuffs, bodices, and necklines in garments where buttons were undesirable, so it would allow you to stretch the thing over your head. So here's image of breeches from the 18th century. They're the equivalent of modern day men's pants, and you can see this particular pair has a fall. A waistcoat is a sleeveless garment worn by men, 18th century equivalent of the modern day vest. This one has a front view with a red lining when it's opened, and it was worn around 1770 to 1790 in Norway. It's made of silk, and it's hand-woven relief velvet, meaning that the velvet has shorter and longer piles to create a pattern. And then the back, that because you're supposed to wear a jacket over this, and you're not supposed to be seen without your jacket on top, like your frock coat. So the back is just plain weave linen, and that allows it to breathe, and so it's more comfortable for the wearer underneath the shirt and the coat and everything else they'd be wearing. So here's a picture of like a basic man's kind of suit. So it would have a coat, breeches, and a waistcoat. Not all three pieces needed to be made of the same fabric, but if they were all made of the same fabric, it was often called a ditto suit. In the second part of the 18th century, the fullness of the coats decreases. So you see that boot cuff that we saw earlier, it's shrunk considerably. And there used to be some side pleats in the jacket. Those were eliminated, and the front of the coat started to curve back towards the sides. And then we had a narrow stand collar, and the sleeves narrowed too. The whole silhouette got slimmer. Sleeveless waistcoats were both single and double-breasted. Double-breasted just means that the front overlaps more, and there's two parallel rows of buttons or snaps or some kind of a closure. And then usually they put, like today, not both rows of the buttons would be functional, so there wouldn't be two rows of buttonholes. There'd just be two rows of buttons and one row of buttonholes. So what they do is they put one button on the inside, and they call that a jigger, just to hold the thing closed and keep the layers in place. So for daytime wear, it was really formal compared to what we do now, but plain woven wool plush, which is something kind of velvet-like but less densely woven, or the fancier velvet. Silks were for day wear, and then satin trimmed with lace, braid, or fur was also fine for day wear. It just depended on where you were going and how much money you had. Here's an image of a man's coat and waistcoat from 1730. It's probably French. It's wool and silk and metallic. The thread is wool, silk, and metallic. The jacket itself is just wool. It's pretty elaborate by today's standards, but it's what guys would have been wearing back then. The coat is stiffened with like a horsehair braid to make it stand out like that. And again, for men's daytime suits, they would decorate it with all kinds of trims. Like these here are different kinds of braids made out of other different cords. And this bottom green one, it's a passementerie that's made with a soutache braid. For men, they would wear a stiff white piece around their neck called a stock. For men after 1730, the cravats tended to be replaced by these neck stocks, which are linen squares folded to form a high neckband that's stiffened with buckram and fastened behind the neck. Buckram is a really stiff fabric that was made sometimes from horsehair. It could have been made from cotton or linen. And it's nowadays, like if you have like well, not even nowadays, if you've seen like an old fabric covered book, it was probably covered with buckram. Also, I don't know if you have the opportunity really to see people wearing hats to church or something, but a lot of times buckram is used to stiffen a hat. And basically, what they do is they soak the fabric in starch to fill in the gaps so it becomes more paper like. So, a lot of times men would tie some black ribbon in a bow around their stock. So, here's some more guys with the black ribbon tied around their stock. And you can see the vest and the frock coat with all of the trimmings, and you can see their socks. It's really interesting. You can even see this little triangular bit here where the knit changes direction to accommodate the heel. You can see all the detail, the buttons, in order to get the narrowness around the knee but still get it over the calves and the heel of the foot. So really interesting. On top, if it was cold or rainy, on top of their suits, they would wear full capes or cloaks. They were often gathered at the neck underneath a flat collar. And then there was also a surtout or a greatcoat. Surtout is French for over everything. And it was the outermost garment, and it was full and wide skirted. It ended below the knee. It generally had cuffed sleeves and as many as 3 broad falling cape like collars that you can see in the back. For around the house, people would wear these like versions of what would now be kind of like a bathrobe, but they were much fancier. They were called nightgowns, morning gowns, dressing gowns, Indian gowns, because that's where they were derived from, India, or banyans. So here's some more banyans. So again, the fancy, it's not supposed to be fancy. This is supposed to be just what you wear around the house. Probably more for wealthier people. Also, when you went out in public, men also often wore wigs, and there were lots of different wig styles for men. Some of the ones that your book mentions are the toupee or the four top, and that is here, number 4. And also the bag wig, which is here. It's like a ponytail. The end is put inside of like a bag. And this would be like the bag that was attached, and it would have a bow on it. And then, trying to think what else they talk about in your book. Oh, here we go. The club wig, also called the carojan. It's similar to the toupee or four-top wig. And the queue, which is the word that they use for the ponytail part, it's extra long, and it's double back on itself and then secured in the middle with a ribbon. It kind of looks like a figure 8 kind of a shape. And then there's all kinds of others, including full-bottomed, and there's just a whole bunch of different wig styles. Brushing the hair straight back into a slightly elevated roll began in the 1730s, and this style was known as the French toupee or an English foretop. From the 1780s, the hair is occasionally dressed in a negligee style, which is like a disheveled crop, kind of like this here. A curl or a puff was sometimes carried over the top of the head from ear to ear. And then sometimes a small puff was placed at each side of the head over the ear, and the hair brushed back from the forehead with the back hair and pulled into like a ponytail or a queue. So again, more hairstyles there. A chapeau bras is a kind of a large flat hat. So instead of a tricorn, it's kind of a bicorn, and it was fashionable to carry it underneath your arm, or for men to carry it underneath their arms, as you can see pictured there. So here's a bicorn and a tricorn, and now we have something called a round hat for riding, similar to what we now call a top hat. Women's garments in the 18th century, again, reflect the improved status of women. One kind of a gown was mantua. I'll have this PowerPoint posted so you can read the details. Here is a silk mantua that I picked up an image from the Met Museum. So usually made out of silk. This one, the name mantua comes from Spain, so that's where the style originated. Then the mantua gradually stiffened and was decorated and expanded with hoops called paniers. By mid-century, it had been stylized into a robe de française or a robe à la française, where it had more of a drum or a cake-like structure inside. So here's a polonaise, which just means that the back is kind of gathered up. We'll get to the robe à la française. Here we go. So you see how the sides stick out quite a bit, right? We'll get to this later too, but these little cuff things are engageants, and there's names for all this stuff. So the stomacher here is also called a compère, and then taking the fabric and scrunching it up, so self fabric, and making more decorations is called robing. This back part is called a watteau back. It's also called a sack back. So here's a robe à la française. It protrudes at the sides, and it's got this watteau or sack back, also called a tea gown later. So this one, instead of the silk being embroidered, it's painted. And then you can see how they added trim that mirrors the colors from the painted ornamentation. And then it's got lace coming down the front with more of the trim mirroring. And then here the stomacher is embroidered, and then the lacing is just for decoration. It's not really functional. And there's the double box pleats in the back. Here's an image of a robe à la anglaise. So you can see the robe à la anglaise here too. So it's got narrower hips, and it's got a more closed neck. It's usually a little shorter too. So robe à la française with the watteau back or the sack back, or the tea gown kind of a back, and then the robe à la anglaise with sort of the polonaise skirt. This is a sock or a robe battante or robe volante or an innocente. So it's supposed to be more comfortable because you're not supposed to need to have your corset on underneath, but I think most women did have all the stuff on underneath anyway. So some more information about how these were structured. So these dresses had these panier structures. So it would tie around the waist here, and then tie in the front and the back around the hips to hold these paniers in place to make the dress stand out like that. And then these are pockets, so there could be slits in the dress, and then these were tied around the waist as well, and they are little like purse things with slits here that they could stick their hands in. And then this is the kind of shoe they would wear. This one's got the clog in it, so the part that you put on over your shoe so that you don't get mud in between the sole and the heel. So here's some pictures of some women wearing the robe battante or the sock or the robe volante. Here's some more images of women in the robe volante. So again, underneath, in order to make the dresses do that thing that they do, they would wear panier or hoops, just a structure to make the dress stick out. Underneath the paniers, they would wear drawers, so like a bifurcated garment. And then on top of the drawers, but underneath the paniers, they would wear a chemise. So you can see the chemise here. And then on top of the chemise, they would wear the corset or stays. And then, so it would be drawers, chemise, paniers, and then corset. And then on top or underneath, they would also have petticoats to make the skirt stick out further. Petticoats can be made of a lot of different materials. So in the summer, they might be made out of linen, and in the winter, they might be made out of wool. They were often quilted, which means they would take 2 layers of fabric and they would put some batting in between or some padding, and then they would stitch designs. That's kind of what you see down here. And then there were different other fabrics. So they could made it out. The weave could be cambric, and it could be out of linen, or it could be dimity, which is cotton, and it could also be made out of flannel, or it could be made out of calico prints, or it could be made out of chintz. So they made petticoats out of just about anything. So as the shape evolved, they just start. This isn't an old. This is a recreation. But the shape of the panier started to change, so it would stick out in the front and back as well, and then it would get narrow in the front and back. And the paniers, they got their name from these baskets that would carry the bread. So here's some images of robe à la française with the panier styling. More robe à la française with the paniers protruding from the hips. Another robe à la française with the watteau or sack back. And here's an image of the watteau back. Here, the stomacher has a bunch of ribbons. They're calling that a shell. Engagement refers to the lace at the elbows here. It's usually a separate piece that gets tied on. Here's another robe à la française, and you can see the engagements here. Here's a really exaggerated robe à la française, right? Look at how wide these are getting, these paniers. And you can see, let me go back where the bigger picture, you can see the seams where they had to stitch pieces of fabric together in order to get this width. So these paniers keep getting bigger and bigger as fashion tends to do. It gets out of hand. So you see how wide she is from the front and back and how narrow she is from the side. So here's a Mantua court dress, but it's got the French paniers. And here's an 18th century fashion doll showing people how they could use the textiles to make themselves their own gown with the panier sides and a train. Here's a coronation gown for someone who is crowned the Queen of Sweden during this period. So she's got the French style panier. Here is a wedding dress for a princess with a really large panier and the very narrow waist. There's another image of it with the train, and you can see how the pattern of the fabric is mirrored in the way they put the trim on the bottom of the underskirt. Here's another gown with panier. So the women's dresses were so out of hand, they didn't know where their dresses ended. You know, it's kind of like driving a big car and you don't know where the end of it is. And so they started putting fences around tables because ladies' dresses kept knocking stuff off of the tables onto the floor. They also came up with French doors. So previously doors were narrow and they widened them so that women were able to fit through the doorways. Jumps were loose, unboned bodices that were worn at home. Wearing a corset, as you can imagine, is not comfortable. And so to get a little relief, you could wear your jump at home. Petenlaire or casacan was a short, hip-length version of a bodice that was worn with a separate gathered skirt. Pinners were circular caps that were placed flat on the head and then usually tied down with a ribbon, either in front of the chin or behind underneath the hairdo. Tête de mouton is a hairstyle achieved with close, tight curls. Bergère or sheepherder's hat is a large flat straw hat with a low crown and a wide brim, and there's a tie that goes either over or under the brim. So this one's under the brim, but the tie could come from the crown and extend over the brim and then perhaps under the chin. A mob cap is something you would wear around the house. A tricorn hat, still popular. False rumps, still happening to make your skirt have that shape that they wanted it to have. This is a Redding tote dress. It's supposed to be similar-ish to what men wore, but this is for horseback riding, and it's got lapels or revers at the neck. These are round gowns. They're closed all the way around. So whereas some gowns have an overskirt that opens in the front, round gowns, the skirts do not open in the front. Chemise à la reine refers to a white muslin gown that resembled an undergarment of the period, but it had a waistline and a soft, fully gathered skirt. And these kinds of dresses stay in fashion for a while. They just get adopted and change a little bit. So here's the chemise à la reine. If you've been to the Huntington Library here in Pasadena, this is similar to what Pinky is wearing in there, the famous Pinky and Blue Boy paintings. So a carasau is a bodice similar to the casacan, often worn with a men's hat, but it's for women. So it's a separate bodice worn over a gathered skirt. After 1760, women's hair began to expand vertically. So they've already got the peigne extending out to the sides. Now their hair starts to grow too. This is often, well, like these images here, these renditions, artist renditions of women's hairstyles. They were done with wigs and then placed on the woman's head. Some other hairstyles are the hedgehog fashion, where they would curl their hair full and wide around the face and then have long locks hanging down the back. So you see here, she's got lots of curls up here and then a really long lock hanging down the back. A caloche and a brocade dress is what she's wearing here. The caloche is a series of hoops sewn together into a hood, which supported the hood without crushing the hair. And this is actually a more modern picture of someone who's dressed up for a costume ball. It's not from the period. And then a tippet is a fur stole that's worn around the shoulders. Shoes still had high heels. They had tongues. They still had the lashets going across the front. They're still wearing mules. You see an Asian influence on shoes because of the trade with India and other Asian countries. Clogs or pattens are still happening. So for inclement weather, to keep the mud and dirt and rocks out from your, getting wedged from in your heels and other yucky things that might be in the streets. Cosmetics are still a happening thing. Those black spots are supposed to be there. They're the patches that they would wear, sometimes round or heart-shaped or star-shaped. They would color their eyebrows in with charcoal. They used creams and rice powder and all kinds of things to color their faces. They would use roots from flowers or flower petals. So all kinds of things to color their lips, cheeks, fingernails. Boys that are older than 7 would wear a kind of a suit that was called a skeleton suit. Here's a little boy in a skeleton suit and a little girl in something that's similar to the robe à la reine. And then after 1780, things started to get a little bit more natural, a little bit. In the 1790s, the waistline was brought up to under the bust, and they were the new way to be fashionable and to push the boundaries was to not wear a lot of undergarments. So that's how they would display their femininity. This is a man's riding boot from the period. And here, and formal shoes had lower heels and wider toes, usually black. There were lots of different kinds of buckles that people would decorate their shoes with. And then there's, again, printing shops existed. So they didn't have photography yet, but they would engrave plates, and they could use that with printing presses. So this is an engraving from around the 1760s of a shoe shop. And this is an engraving of one of the shops where you would buy feathers to decorate your fashion with. And this is a milliner's shop where you would buy hats and headwear. And this is a wig maker / wig barber. And this is a tailor. This is a furrier shop where you would buy fur, either fur stoles or muffs or just fur trim for a coat or something. This is an embroiderer, and what you see here, stretched across here, is the shape of a man's jacket the border is being embroidered, and then this is the shape of the pocket flap that's being embroidered. And here too, this is the shape of a man's jacket that's being embroidered. So this is a sample of a kind of dress that would have been worn in the 18th century, and it's got a trapunto or quilted petticoat underneath. This is a painting by Antoine Watteau, and that's where the name Watteau gown comes from. So this is that pleated sort of cape-like piece that hangs off the back of the gown that they call a Watteau gown. So here's another image of the Watteau gown. Here's a list of the key terms from the book. There are more, but here are most of the ones that you'll see in bold throughout the book that you'll want to choose one of them for your illustrated vocabulary list entry. That is all. I will see you in the next chapter.